Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Andrew Norman. He teaches philosophy at Carnegie Mellon University. He works on the conceptual and historical foundations of humanism. He has published widely on the nature of reason and the teaching of wisdom, and written books on critical thinking and the structure of dialogue. And today we're going to talk about his new book, Mental Immunity, Infectious Ideas, Mind-Parasites, and the Search for a Better Way to Think. And there it is. Very nice cover, by the way. And it was a great read, Dr. Norman. Welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you.
It's a pleasure to be here, Ricardo. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so let's talk about this idea of cognitive immunology. So, could you tell us what it's really about?
Sure. So cognitive immunology is an emerging science of mental immunity. So just as our bodies have immune systems that protect us against infectious microbes, it turns out our minds have immune systems that protect us from infectious ideas. And just as our body's immune systems can function more or less well, our mental immune systems can function more or less well. And I mean, we typically say things like, so-and-so is more or less resistant to believing in the tooth fairy, say, right? But such talk can be reframed in terms of immunity. So the more susceptible you are to a bad idea, the less immunity you have. And the less susceptible you are, the more immunity you have. So it's very easy to bring in the language of immunity. And when you do, you start to see things that we often miss. And so it turns out there's a good deal of cutting edge research that is confirming that minds have immune systems, and that by understanding it in those terms, we can actually help make them function better.
Mhm. But isn't there a point where that analogy maybe breaks down? Because, I mean, is it really the case that ideas behave like parasites, like viruses, for example?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So I think almost everyone, when they first encounter this idea, says, oh, that's an interesting analogy, or that's an interesting metaphor. And I actually think we're watching the metaphor morph into something literal before our eyes. And so a recent example of this is the word meme. So when Richard Dawkins coined the word meme to mean a bit of culture that can propagate by imitation, he specifically said, hey, this is kind of an analogy. I'm forming this concept based on an analogy. And when many people first heard the concept, they assumed it was just a metaphor, and they used it with scare quotes. And then it turned out to be so useful for helping us understand how information spreads across the internet, for example, that people dropped the scare quotes. And now the term meme has entered the lexicon of science. And respectable scientists from many different fields will say, yeah, memes are real. Memes exist. So I think the exact same thing is happening with our concept of mind parasites. So think about it this way. Things have to have certain qualities to count as a parasite. So smallpox, for example, it requires a host. It can infiltrate that host, create copies of itself. A lot of times a virus will actually commandeer the cell's copying machinery to create copies of itself. An influenza-infected person will often sneeze particles of the virus, thereby infecting other bodies with flu. And of course, parasites generally sort of thrive at the expense of their hosts. That's built into the definition of a parasite. And if you go down the line, it turns out bad ideas check all the boxes. They require a host mind. They can infiltrate a mind, commandeer its copying machinery, create copies of itself, induce behavior to spread it to other minds, say proselytizing behavior, right? And just as microbes can flourish at the expense of our bodily health, bad ideas can flourish at the expense of our mental health.
But why did you come up with this idea of cognitive immunology? Were there any particular reasons? Is it because you think particularly people are particularly susceptible to bad ideas? Is it that somewhere in the recent history there are more bad ideas people are exposed to, or something
Yeah,
like that?
yeah. Just since the turn of the millennium, we've seen crazy ideologies propagate across the internet in very alarming ways. QAnon conspiracy theory here in the US I guess it's now spread across the world, is an interesting example. But science denial, alien abduction theories, maybe hasn't been particularly big since the turn of the millennium, but divisive political ideologies, new forms of religious fundamentalism, all have cropped up and begun to propagate in ways that are threatening our collective well-being. We need a better way to understand this. And the tools of memetics, the science of how memes or information can spread through populations, I think offer us important tools for combating these dangerous phenomena. And so Dawkins proposed proposed a science called information epidemiology back in the early 90s. He was like, hey, let's actually study the way information propagates through cultures. And it turns out you can use the equations developed by epidemiologists to make sense of the way information and disinformation spread. I think that in addition to a science of how information and disinformation spread, we also need a science of how our minds either resist or fail to resist the uptake of bad ideas. So I'm dubbing that field of inquiry cognitive immunology, and encouraging many of my scholarly colleagues to help me develop our understanding of mental immune systems.
But then on the other hand, and because I've also had on the show people like Hugo Mercier and Ian Dunsperber talk about epistemic vigilance, isn't it the case that, people are not that susceptible to bad ideas? Because, they have these sort of cognitive mechanisms that allow them to avoid being, let's say, infected by bad ideas.
Yeah, so I think cognitive vigilance is a good concept, and those who exercise zero cognitive vigilance will quickly become infected with bad ideas. But just as it's possible to be under vigilant, it's possible to be over vigilant. So you can be so suspicious of new information that your mind screens out many truths. So vigilance can help screen out falsehoods, but if you're too suspicious, you end up preventing many truths from entering your mind, and that's a corresponding kind of failure. So you can be too trusting for your own good, but you can also be too suspicious for your own good. And when you study the way conspiracy theories work, a lot of times conspiracy thinking is rooted in a kind of hypervigilant, cynical suspiciousness, and that can lead to some of the worst deformities of cognition. We need to be aware of that as well.
Yeah. And do you intend for cognitive immunology to be a scientific discipline or simply a philosophical discipline? How does it work exactly?
I'm quite confident that it will become a scientific discipline. I think it's in the process of becoming that already. Respectable psychologists, cognitive scientists, social psychologists have all begun to use the language of mind-parasite and the language of inoculation. So turns out that psychologists have been studying ways to inoculate minds against information of different kinds for almost 60 years. So back in the 1960s, a psychologist named William McGuire discovered that if you expose a mind to a weakened form of an argument, the mind will often develop resistance even to stronger versions of the same argument. And if you accompany that, the refutation of the weakened form with derision or ridicule, the effect becomes even more powerful. So you can, for example, ridicule and diminish socialism, and your audience will often develop kind of a visceral aversion to any ideas that might be perceived as socialist, and you can thereby sort of hijack mental immune systems to dismiss ideas that might actually help to promote the common welfare.
Mm-hmm. And would it have certain specific objects of study if it is scientific?
I'm sorry, Ricardo. Pose that again. I'm not quite sure I got the question.
I mean, as a scientific discipline, what would be its objects of study?
Well, I think first and foremost, it would study how the mind's immune system works, and why it fails, when it fails, what sort of things weaken or compromise mental immune systems, and what kinds of things can strengthen or fortify them against corruption. So I guess I would define cognitive immunology as the science of mental immunity, and it aims for a robust understanding of how minds develop resistance to bad ideas and how minds can lose their resistance to bad ideas.
Mm-hmm. And we've been talking about, and even you just used the term bad ideas, but how do we determine that something is a bad idea?
Wonderful question. So many scientists have been allergic to frank talk about bad ideas because it seems to entail value judgments. And for a long time, we've been under the impression that scientists shouldn't make value judgments. And so there's been sort of a cognitive allergy to talking about in some of the ways that I've been recommending. So there are a bunch of truths about ideas that I think every well-meaning person should share. Truth is a good quality in an idea. Falsehood is a bad quality. Usefulness is a good quality, and harmfulness is a bad quality. An idea can be confusing, and that's bad. An idea can be inspiring, and that's good. So a given idea can have many of these properties. And some of the properties might be good making, and other property or make it might recommend the idea, and other properties are bad making and might recommend against embracing the idea. When a cognitive immunologist uses the word bad idea, he's not saying, he or she is not saying, idea I happen to disapprove of. So there's a shift here that goes on. We tend to assume that frank talk of goodness or badness is merely a matter of subjective opinion. But philosophers have long recommended talking about right and wrong in ways that are more objective. So instead of saying, gee, do I happen to approve or think, do I happen to like this idea or not? We can instead say, let's take a careful look at the properties this idea has, both logical and causal, and see if we can come up with an objective determination of whether this idea is serving us well.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, how would we go about doing that exactly?
So the short answer, I think, is through Socratic dialogue. So when you get together with people who see the world differently, and you converse in a mutually respectful way, and you help each other see the defects of ideas, not just the defects, but also the virtues of ideas. So when we dialogue together, Ricardo, about something, let's say we come on from opposite sides of the political spectrum. In principle, we could have a respectful dialogue where you call attention to the downsides of my political ideology, and I can use reasons to draw your attention to the good features of my ideology, and vice versa. such dialogues can and do happen. And when they do, they tend to lead to deeper, more understanding, both mutual understanding of one another, but also a deeper understanding of the world we live in.
Mhm.
So Socratic dialogue, I guess I would say, is a marvelously powerful way to see more clearly the drawbacks of buying into ideas that often pass or that we often take for granted.
Could you explain the concept of reason you apply in the book? Because, I mean, there could be different definitions of reason out there. So, what is yours?
Yeah. So when I talk about Socratic dialogue, I'm talking about reasoning together to find out what's true, or what we should believe together.
Right.
And any such dialogue will be built upon understandings of what counts as reasonable and what doesn't. So whenever we make assertions, we're relying sometimes unthinkingly on certain standards of what's reasonable and what isn't. And so the way in which dialogue plays out is very sensitively dependent on our concepts of reasonable belief, or concepts of reasonable idea. And philosophers have been examining different standards of reasonable belief for a couple thousand years and basically performing thought experiments where they go, well, let's assume we all bought into this standard of reasonableness. How would that work out? Suppose we all accepted standard X or definition X of reasonable. Imagine how dialogue would go. Imagine how inquiry would work. Imagine how our minds would work if we bought into that standard. Look, if we bought into this standard, it turns out our dialogue breaks down. Or, you buy into this standard, turns out our minds don't function very well. Better throw that standard out. Let's try another one. So philosophers have been doing thought experiments, testing different possible standards of reasonableness for thousands of years. And although we haven't settled on a single unique definition of reasonable, we've been able to weed out a lot of pretenders, a lot of dysfunctional proposals. So we have a somewhat clearer sense of where the answer might lie, even if we don't have the final answer in hand yet. In the book, I argue that we can actually advance this process beyond where philosophers have taken it in the past, and actually gain a considerably clearer understanding of what we mean by reasonable judgment or wise judgment.
Yeah. And how would we do that exactly? I mean, is there a quicker way of arriving at perhaps what would be the best standard of reasonable belief?
Yeah, so let me tell a little story here on this. So when Socrates, the ancient Greek philosopher, would wander the streets of Athens, he had a certain modus operandi. He'd basically pigeonhole someone and say, hey, let's talk about your core values. Let's talk about justice. Let's talk about truth. Let's talk about knowledge. And say, tell me what you understand that term to mean. And the other guy would offer a definition, and then Socrates would wield questions in brilliant ways to expose the defects of their proposed standards. Now, one of the first, so Socrates essentially functioned with the assumption that if a belief can't withstand questioning, it's not worth embracing. So the proper way to test ideas on the Socratic, what I call the Socratic picture of reason, is to subject the idea to rigorous questioning and see what happens. And if it fails the test, throw the idea out. Now, not long after that, his pupil, Plato, contemplated an alternative definition. Plato said, hey, surely what makes ideas reasonable are the reasons you can marshal in support of them, right? And that idea has just had this almost bewitching, seductive appeal to the philosophical mind in part because it seems to make perfect sense of what happens in mathematics when you provide a demonstration or a proof of something, right? Surely it's the supporting proof of a theorem that makes the theorem proven, or right? The problem with this idea is that if you buy into it completely, you end up being more susceptible to confirmation bias. It actually exacerbates confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is a phenomenon whereby we kind of get attached to our ideas and we look for confirming evidence, and we kind of either ignore or don't notice or dismiss disconfirming or falsifying evidence. And it can lead to some of the worst forms of mind infection, right? So Plato had actually come up with an extremely plausible answer to the question, what makes a belief reasonable? Namely, its supporting reasons. But it turns out if you buy into that concept and pay no attention to the reasons against, right? If you only pay attention to the reasons for and don't pay attention to the reasons against, the ones weighing down on the idea, you're going to be more prone to confirmation bias and various cognitive defects. So I actually argue in the book that the Platonic picture of reasonable belief, which our culture kind of pre-installs in most of our minds, that it's exacerbating a very common cognitive habit, a habit of mind that doesn't serve us well. We need to go back to the Socratic conception of reasonable belief, clean it up a little bit. And I argue that when we do, we actually come up with something we might call a mind vaccine, something that can do a great deal to inoculate our minds against bad ideas.
So in that sense, would you say that reasoning functions better in social contexts? I mean, does it work better when we dialogue or discuss with people than alone?
Absolutely, because I'm not always aware of the defects of my own ideas. A lot of times you'll be able to spot the defects of my ideas better than I can. So yes, I think idea testing is and ought to be a team sport. And this is one of the real beauties of science, which is that it's a crowdsourced form of idea testing. It's the verdict of the entire community of scientists, many of whom oppose one another's ideas. That is the real test of scientific truth. So if you go off by yourself and simply test ideas on your own in a bubble, you're very unlikely to arrive at wisdom. Plato said that thinking is the mind's dialogue with itself, but we fundamentally learn the process of dialogue in social contexts and then internalize it. But it's a mistake to internalize it and then just go off by yourself and ignore the opinions and the objections of others, because a lot of times we need to take account of such things to think correctly and deeply about any number of things. So yeah, thinking is a team sport.
So tell us about critical thinking. I mean, how do you understand that?
Yeah, so the term was coined about a century ago by the philosopher John Dewey. And his idea was that in the same way that scientists test ideas and eliminate the worst ones, that each and every one of us, even without lab coats, even without a scientific credential, can think in ways that test ideas and toss out the worst ones. A terrific idea, beautiful idea. And people in higher education have loved that concept for many, many decades. And it's arguable, if you ask university professors, what do your students get from your teaching, even if they won't go on to a career in, say, chemistry? They'll always say, well, they'll get critical thinking skills, of course. My teaching imparts critical thinking skills, and that's the residue that will seep into their lives and enrich their lives, even after they've forgotten the details of my chemistry lectures. So there's a common conceit in higher education that our teaching does teach critical thinking, but very few, there's been actually a study that says that very few people in higher education can say what they mean by critical thinking, let alone defend their definitions of critical thinking. When we think about teaching as the art of imparting critical thinking skills, we're putting blinders on ourselves for a number of reasons. Number one is skills aren't enough. If you give somebody a set of skills and then they weaponize those skills, if you give somebody a set of critical thinking skills and they use them to bludgeon their opponents, but don't use them to modify their own thinking, you've created not a well-adjusted citizen, but an ideologue. In fact, you've created an effective propagandist. So for a long time in higher education, we've been focusing on imparting critical thinking skills and creating generations of people who are really good at slash and burn argumentation analysis that allows them to find fault with others. But we've neglected the virtue of fair-mindedness and the insistence that people apply those very same skills to their own thinking, which is even harder than applying them to other people. And so what I like to say is there's a whole lot more to mental immune health than the ability to think critically. And when you view the process of education through the lens of cognitive immunology, you start to see all kinds of ways in which the critical thinking paradigm, the paradigm that's prevailed in higher education for the better part of a century, why it's not doing enough to protect our minds against cognitive contagion. And surely the phenomena of the last couple of decades, where crazy ideas have flourished on the internet, are showing us that we're not doing enough to prevent cognitive contagion. And an alarming 43% of college-educated American voters voted for Donald Trump in 2016. 43% of college-educated voters. Now that strikes me as a massive failure of America's critical thinking factory. And it means we need to rethink education in profound ways. And I think cognitive immunology gives us the right tools for taking education to the next level.
But would critical thinking be a specific set of cognitive tools or principles that people would follow and would apply across different fields of inquiry, or would we have to adapt it to each specific field?
Yeah, I think so. I've loved the concept of critical thinking for much of my life, and I've sought to understand what it means to think critically, and I've sought to teach critical thinking to my students. And I think the concept is certainly well-intentioned, and everyone in higher education who strives to impart critical thinking skills is I'm sure, is trying to do the right thing. The problem is just that the concept is too blunt to really serve us well. It's kind of a catch-all phrase that ends up meaning the way we educated people like to think. It doesn't really provide a ton of guidance. Now you can take a close look at critical thinking textbooks and the way they teach critical thinking and get more specific about this. Most of the critical thinking textbooks that or informal logic textbooks or argumentation textbooks that I've worked with and read, they basically point to many, many different fallacies that our minds are prone to, and they inadvertently give the impression that thinking is a minefield. And I was actually teaching critical thinking at one point at a small college in upstate New York, and I was teaching from a textbook that was basically saying, here's 51 ways your thinking can go haywire. And my students were just like, oh man, I don't want to go there. It's like, do I really have to think? I mean, thinking just seems to me to be too hazardous. I realized I was not serving them well. I was scaring them rather than empowering them. So we actually, throughout the textbook, I introduced this concept of mental immunity to bad ideas. We studied how how bodily immune systems work, and we tried to figure out what the mind's antibodies are and how we can wield those antibodies to better effect. I got to tell you, Ricardo, that class just came alive. It went from being dull and uninspired to one where we were just had so much energy for learning. It was transformative. And I actually think I stumbled upon a better way to teach critical thinking. And I really hope it spreads through higher education and inspires a new generation of next level thinkers.
But could you give us more details about that? I mean, how did you manage to, to transmit, let's say, principles of critical thinking to your students?
Yeah. So maybe a story will help here. So when I first came across the idea that minds might have immune systems, this was an idea that was kind of between the lines of an essay Richard Dawkins wrote in the early 90s. I walked into class the next day and I said, hey guys, put down your pens for a second. Tell me, do you think a mind can become infected? And the students were like puzzled. And then one of them said, you mean a brain? And I was like, no, I don't mean a brain, I mean a mind. And another student says, well, infected with what? I was like, bad ideas. And they said, you're asking us if a mind can become infected with bad ideas? And I said, yeah. And they said, well, obviously, yes. And I was like, no, I want you to really take the infection analogy seriously. I want you guys to discuss it. Break into groups, and they spent about 20 minutes talking about it. I said, then come back and tell me if you think the metaphor of mind infection really makes sense. They went off and did that. And again, this was before the internet had taken off, early 90s, right? And they came back and they said, yeah, we actually think mind infections happen. And I was like, all right, guys, which of your beliefs are legit and which of them are just mind infections? And this silence descended on the room, and they were like, oh shit. It's like, which of my beliefs are mind infections? And how do I figure out which is which, and how do I get rid of the mind infections, right? They were suddenly alive to this problem, and the language of mind infection helped to energize them to hunt down the bad ideas and to rid their minds of them. So I think it introduced a whole new dynamic into the class. I mean, we ended up basically saying, all right, here's a simple idea testing game, and you can spell out the rules of the game, and the students became the players in the game, and there are certain rules, certain moves you can make in the game to test ideas and defend, to challenge them and defend them. And I said, all right, we're going to call this the reason-giving game, and the rest of this course, we're just going to play the game. And they were like, we get to play a game in a college course and like get credit for it? And I was like, yeah, we're going to play a game. I said, you get to choose the topics you want to think about. I said, you guys come in next week and tell me which ideas you want to test. They came in, they were just so excited because they wanted to think about the things that mattered to them. And I said, all right, now let's play the reason-giving game. Let's test your favorite hypotheses. And man, you should have seen them come alive. That they just loved the process of playing this game to test ideas. And I actually think that's the right way now to build our immunity to bad ideas.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to things like ideological thinking, I mean, are all ideologies bad thinking, or are they all composed by bad ideas, or is that something, I mean, or should we be more specific about it?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ricardo. So it turns out that the concept of ideology is used in two very different ways. Some people just use it to mean any belief system at all. So if I happen to believe in tooth fairies, that's my ideology. If I happen to believe in the free market system, I'm a free market. I have a free market ideology. Um, I think that's a missed opportunity. When you use the concept of ideology to mean any belief system at all, you're just creating a redundant designation. We already have perfectly good words for that, like belief system or worldview, right? We don't need another synonym for those things. Instead, let's reserve the term ideology for systems of belief that are objectively problematic, that are demonstrably problematic. So I'm proposing, so some people already use the term ideology that way, and I'm proposing that we all use it the second way, because we actually need a term for worldviews that are objectively problematic, because they're out there proliferating and bringing great harm to humanity. We need a term to designate them, and we need to be candid and forthright about that. Not all worldviews are equally good for us. Some worldviews improve humanity's collective prospects, and other worldviews actually harm humanity's prospects. We need to stop this silly idea that all worldviews are created equal. That's just not that. That's a false equivalence. It's not serving us well. And I propose that we use the term ideology to designate the ones that are demonstrably problematic.
But can we justify holding beliefs that are not supported by the evidence?
So most of my scientific friends think that we should only believe things on sufficient evidence. And by and large, I think that's a wonderful standard of reasonable belief. But I don't think it covers all cases. Think about the idea that we have rights. The right to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Many of my liberal, scientifically minded friends are perfectly happy to say that that's true, to embrace that view, to endorse it. And I ask, well, what's your evidence for it? They suddenly find themselves tongue-tied, right? It was once, what does Jefferson say? We are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. That's the idea that rights exist because God gave them to us. Many well-educated liberal people have since sort of just dropped the God belief and accept that rights, that we have rights because it's not because we have evidence that we have rights, but because it's useful to think that we have rights. So the real case for rights talk points to the downstream consequences of believing rather than the upstream evidence that we have rights. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So the conceit that we should only believe things based on upstream evidence actually turns out to admit of exceptions. Yes, it's terribly important that we be cognizant of the evidence or the lack thereof for many of our beliefs, but it turns out that the downstream consequences of our beliefs also matters and affects human well-being in powerful ways. So I argued that for a long time, so this is chapter 6 of the book, Mental Immunity, there's a famous debate between two intellectual titans back in the 1870s. One of them, William Clifford, argued that anytime you believe something on insufficient evidence, you're being profoundly unethical. He argued that non-evidence-based belief is morally wrong. And then the famous Harvard psychologist, William James, jumped in and said, you got to be crazy, Clifford. Lots of beliefs are permissible because they help us socially or psychologically. So believing that, James was particularly interested in defending religious faith, and he argued that, faith that that God will protect you can induce a kind of peace of mind that is hugely beneficial, quite apart from whether or not there's evidence for that view. I think that both men had a piece of the truth because upstream evidence matters, downstream consequences matter, and genuine wisdom takes both into account.
But I mean, what criterion should we favor here when we're talking about cognitive immunology? I mean, to what extent should we take into account perhaps the psychological benefits that some wrong beliefs have?
I think so. So let's take the belief that God will provide. I happen to think that the upstream evidence for that is extremely shaky. I'm an atheist, but I can easily imagine that there are people less fortunate than me who derive a kind of comfort from that idea that they need. So my first response is that I need to be sympathetic to people who need that belief. And I need to treat them with humanity and decency and respect. And I need to treat the belief carefully because it might underpin their psychological well-being in one way or another. At the same time, I recognize that that belief can serve short-term emotional needs, sometimes at our long-term collective expense. So suppose the idea that, oh, don't worry, God will provide, lets me sleep better at night, but it also allows me to dismiss fears of climate change. Don't worry, God will take care of it. I might be buying a kind of selfish short-term peace of mind at the expense of our long-term collective future. That long-term collective cost matters just as much as the short-term psychological benefit, and we need to take both into account.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, but when you mentioned, for example, human rights, that's a very interesting question there. So, should it always be the case that we should try to replace, for example, religious beliefs with secular beliefs that have the same sort of psychological benefits?
You're showing me that you read the book very carefully, Ricardo, and for that I'm grateful. Yes, I do argue that as a rule, religious beliefs buy believers social and psychological benefits, but often at our long-term collective expense. So many religious beliefs, or religious avowals, I should say, serve as a signal that you belong in a certain group. And you can gain a certain kind of social acceptance by making such avowals. And social acceptance is important. Social acceptance matters. But if it exacerbates our native tribalism and leads us into religious warfare, we're suffering sometimes enormous collective costs just to indulge what I argue is fundamentally irresponsible and selfish habits of belief formation. So I'm imploring my religious friends to think hard about what really constitutes responsible belief, morally responsible belief, and to have the courage to let go of beliefs that merely serve self while eroding cultural norms of accountable talk that are extraordinarily important for our collective future. And to elaborate on this point, when you're raised to believe that faith is a virtue, and that allows you to excuse dogmatic tenacity, dogmatic a dogmatic grip on your cherished beliefs, again, that might cement your status within a certain social circle, but it also tends to erode a norm that is absolutely critical to our collective well-being. And that norm says each and every one of us have an obligation to yield to better reasons. So when I dialogue with you, Ricardo, and I have the better reasons, I expect you to see that and change your mind. But the price of admission to such a dialogue is that I need to be equally persuadable. I need to be willing to yield if your reasons prove to be better. And this norm, I call it reason's fulcrum, because it basically says each and every one of us must yield to better reasons. It's critical to dialogue. It's critical to inquiry. It's critical to procedural justice. It's procedural to problem solving of almost every sort. And when we compromise that norm in order to indulge our tribal allegiances or our psychological needs, we're subverting the norm that keeps our minds healthy. In fact, I argue that this norm, reason's fulcrum, is the linchpin of the mind's immune system. When you damage it, thinking begins to go haywire. And unfortunately, a good deal of religious dogmatism, I think, deserves to be recognized as deeply subversive of this norm.
Mm-hmm. But in that case, it's because of the sort of social consequences, right? Because, if we're either talking about religious beliefs or secular beliefs, so for example, just to give the example of of human rights, they are also not supported by any kind of, for example, scientific evidence, right?
Right. So my own belief in human rights is candidly based on the downstream usefulness of that idea. So I'm candid that I have zero evidence that human beings are endowed with such rights. I don't have any of what would traditionally be called evidence for that belief. But I know from having studied history that the concept of human rights has done a great deal to improve human welfare. And that's why I embrace the concept of human rights.
Mm-hmm. So in this case, is yours an Enlightenment project?
Yeah, very much. I'm a huge fan of the Enlightenment, and when you compare the human condition before and after the Enlightenment, there's just no question that humanity was well served by many of the ideas that inspired the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment, if you don't know, speaking now to your listeners, was the movement in Europe that spread across Europe in the 17th, 18th, I guess mainly the 18th century. And it basically brought the ideals of reason, science, and democracy into Europe, helped spread those widely, and human welfare improved dramatically on many, many measurable dimensions as a result. So whereas orthodoxy and dogmatic faith prevailed for much of the Dark Ages, thereby making them dark, the idea of reason and skepticism and enlightened belief change inspired the Enlightenment and dramatically improved human welfare. I think we have something like actually a natural experiment there in history that shows how dramatically we can change the world if we go back to Enlightenment ideals. So yes, I'm a huge fan of the Enlightenment, and I'm actively advocating for a new second Enlightenment.
Mm-hmm. So, and what if some of these sort of cognitive ways of thinking about things that we have, what if, for example, some biases and heuristics that we have we are innately predisposed to them, and it's not really possible to eliminate them? Would that be a problem, and how would you deal with that?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of work in psychology over the last few decades that illustrate how many biases affect human thinking. There's social biases, there are cognitive biases, and they distort our thinking in systematic ways. And it's important to understand those biases so that we can, in part because it makes us more humble, but also because we can begin to correct for them. Now, the perspective that's emerged from this suggests that our minds are just so inevitably infected by bias that objectivity and reason are just hopeless ideals. Not even worth striving for, because the biases will always be there preventing us from achieving. Now, I think that's a dangerous, bad argument, in part because it makes the perfect the enemy of the good. It's true that we will never be perfectly objective, but it matters enormously that we become a little bit more marginally objective every single day, right? I think if you give up on pursuing this goal of reason and enlightenment and objectivity entirely, you're just left adrift with no idea about what progress might mean. But if we understand that we don't have to be perfectly objective, we just have to be more objective and more reasonable than we have been in the past. And sometimes I actually think that if we can go from, I don't know, 97% irrational to 93% irrational, that we could actually transform the human condition in dramatic ways. Marginal improvements along this one dimension can ramify through our culture in powerful ways. Yeah, does that work for you as an answer?
Yeah, but I mean, just to pick on that last bit, would you say that people are more irrational than they are rational, or not?
Yeah. So we're certainly a mix of rational and irrational. So Aristotle famously defined man as the rational animal. And it's easy to ridicule that definition by pointing to how prone we are to unreason. But the fact is, we're capable of being more or less reasonable. We're somewhere on the continuum between rational and irrational. And I think it doesn't serve us well to view it as all or nothing, right? We can be a little bit more reasonable, we can be a lot less reasonable, and it matters that we focus on marginal improvement. So I'm reluctant to say that we are rational animals. I'm reluctant to say that we're just irredeemably irrational animals. We're somewhere in the middle, and we have it within us to become more rational. And that's all we need to get the project up and running.
Mm-hmm. So now talking about moral values, do you think that we can treat values or they can be scrutinized as empirical facts?
Wow, wonderful question also. So for a long time in the West, we've distinguished between value inquiry and factual inquiry. Mm-hmm. And the distinction goes back to a kind of a division of labor that arose in the wake of Galileo's trials. So at Galileo's trial, where he was convicted of heresy, he was said to have muttered under his breath, "The Bible describes the way to go to heaven, not the way the heavens go." Right? He had been advocating for an unorthodox picture of the solar system, describing the motion of the planets in different ways. And he was convicted of heresy as a result. And ever since then, I mean, what Galileo was essentially channeling was the idea of a division of labor. Leave the facts to the scientists, he was saying. And religion and ethicists, those guys can take care of the values. And ever since then, we've bought into the idea that something like an objective scientific method can help us determine the facts. And that idea has served us enormously well. Science has improved our understanding of the world of facts just in astonishing ways. But the other side of that ideology is that, values, they're just subjective. You know, we can't really investigate right and wrong the way we investigate what's true and false or what's factual and not factual. I actually think that ideology is serving us poorly because it allows ideological stubbornness to flourish in value domains like economics and politics and ethics, where they should be replaced by open inquiry and rational belief modification. I actually think we can speak meaningfully about moral facts. So I actually think it's an objective fact that kindness promotes human well-being better than cruelty does. So let me slow that down and think about that for a second. Some people say there's no such thing as a moral fact. It's objectively, factually true that kindness promotes well-being better than cruelty does. And I think many similar things can be said. Justice promotes human well-being better than injustice does. Honesty tends to promote human well-being better than dishonesty does. There are reasons why we approve of honesty and justice and kindness, because they really do work to promote our well-being. And that's what ethics should be about, promoting our collective well-being.
Mm-hmm. But in this case, are we treating moral values as empirical facts, or can we derive moral values from empirical facts?
Wow, you ask that's a really tough philosophical question, and it can send us into deep waters very quickly. I do think there are some moral facts, and so tell you what, let me say I'm not sure what I do think there are some very clear examples of moral facts, and I've just cited a few of them. I won't go so far as to say that all values are either objectively right or objectively wrong. I won't go that far. I do think it's terribly important for practical purposes that we view value inquiry as something that can lead to deeper understanding of right and wrong. So in the book I talk about something called the attitude of the morally incurious. And the idea here is that, well, values are just subjective. You have your sense of right and wrong, I have mine. Well, who's to say who's right and who's wrong? And if I were to say that I'm right, I would be intolerant of your alternative views of right and wrong. And that attitude is just corrosive of the whole idea that we might profitably inquire together and arrive at a deeper, more nuanced understanding of right and wrong. Because why bother inquiring if there's no such thing as the right answer, right? Or even a better answer. I think even just for practical purpose, setting aside the ontological question of whether there are moral facts, there are hugely powerful practical reasons why we should treat moral questions as having better and worse answers that we can approach through collaborative inquiry.
Mm-hmm. But if we are evaluating, for example, the effects that certain moral values have, aren't we committing to a consequentialist ethics?
We're certainly committing to a form of moral belief testing that has a significant consequentialist component, yes. So I do think that trying out different norms and seeing how well they serve us, do they serve us well or don't they? That's got to be an important part of value inquiry. I'm not sure it's the entirety. So one of the weird things about consequentialism is that they say the consequences of an act completely determine the rightness or wrongness of it, and the motives have nothing whatsoever to do with right or wrong. I think that's a mistake. I think our motives matter also, and that for certain purposes we need to focus on those. So I'm not a consequentialist in any simplistic sense, but I think everyone must acknowledge that the consequences of our value judgments matter, and that we can actually do a kind of consequentialist idea testing, and that's an important part of ethical inquiry.
Mm-hmm. But just to push you a little bit more on that, When it comes to the consequences of adopting certain moral values, to evaluate them, aren't we also sort of, I mean, don't we also have to commit to specific moral values? Because, I mean, to say that something that is the consequence of certain actions is good or bad, we're going back to the question of why is it good or bad, right?
Right. So I think a really important question for people who are interested in value inquiry is what is it that makes good things good and bad things bad, or right things right and wrong things wrong, right? And I actually think that those questions are critical to developing a deeper and more nuanced understanding of our moral obligations. And consequences are a very important part of what makes right acts right and wrong acts wrong. But I'm not sure that it's always the full story. I mean, it's easy to imagine a well-intentioned person diving into a river to save a drowning child and inadvertently drowning the child, right? Accidentally drowning the child. The consequence is terrible, right? The child drowns. Should the person who tried to rescue them be prosecuted for murder because they caused the death of the child? No, their intention was noble, and that needs to be taken into account also, right? So consequences alone aren't the whole story about right and wrong.
So now to talk a little bit about what people can do to improve their cognition. So when we were talking about cognitive immunology, you mentioned a mind vaccine. So what would that be? Would it have specific ingredients?
Yeah. So, oh wow, great question. Yeah, let me mention a few of its ingredients. So there's no magic bullet mind vaccine. I can't I can't say 7 magic words and inoculate your mind against all kinds of mind parasites. I wish I could, but I don't. I can't do that. But I can give you several tips that could dramatically strengthen many mental immune systems. So here's one of them. Befriend questions. So it turns out our doubts and our qualms and our reservations, those are the mind's antibodies. And if an idea flits before your mind and you have a little vague set of qualms about it, that's your mind's immune system trying to warn you that idea might have some troublesome properties. Learn to listen to those qualms, learn to listen to those doubts, and learn to express them. Help them gain expression by listening to them so closely that you can express what they're trying to say clearly and succinctly with a question. And when you do that, when you learn that art of expressing doubts with questions, you end up strengthening the mind's immune system. This doesn't mean that we should take all of our doubts at face value. Sometimes our mind generates hyperbolic doubts, like as in the case of conspiracy theorists, right? But understanding that doubts are are the antibodies of the mind, understanding that can help you build mental immunity. Here's another tip that I think can help. Always reason to find out, never reason to win. So when you take sides in a culture war, you start looking for reasons that you can use as weapons and to bash the people on the other side of the conflict. Or perhaps you grasp onto reasons so that you can use them as a shield, as a defense. But when you start to reason in ways that are defensive or offensive, you're actually subverting your mind's immune system. The world's best thinkers consistently reason to find out, and they avoid becoming culture warriors and reasoning to win. So if you find that you're actually latching on to reasons so that you can use them to club people you disagree with, notice that and back away. your mind will be healthier as a result. Let's see. How about another one? Here's one. There's a phenomenon called identity protective cognition. So it turns out that when we hitch our identity to certain beliefs, that when people come along and challenge those beliefs, we get defensive very quickly, and our mind's immune systems mobilize quickly to neutralize the threat that the questions or challenges present. Well, it turns out that's not healthy. And the best way to avoid that kind of mental immune misfiring is to not hitch your identity to certain beliefs. Try to avoid identity protective cognition. Here's a helpful way to do that. Think of your beliefs as house guests that might wear out their welcome at any time. Maybe your beliefs are serving you relatively well at present, but there may come a time when you learn some new things or you encounter some new information and suddenly realize that your ideas have outlived their usefulness or are an obstacle to your own growth as a human being. When that happens, you have to be willing to let go of those beliefs, show them the door and say, see ya. Thanks for your help, but you know what? You're not quite nuanced enough for my purposes anymore. See you later. So think of your beliefs as house guests, and don't treat them as heirloom furniture to be clung to jealously and passed down through the generations. Doing that will compromise your mind's immune system. So that's a handful of things you can do to strengthen mental immunity, and then the book talks about many, many more.
Would you have something like herd immunity in this case?
I think that as a species, so if you look back at history through the lens that cognitive immunology provides, you realize that cognitive contagions have torn societies apart again and again and again. And it has led neighboring nations into war. And so mind infections are a huge source of human suffering. And if we can develop out the science of mental immunity and become better at spotting the mind parasites and preventing them from propagating, not just across the internet, but through social networks, informal face-to-face social networks. If we can do all of that, we can move much, much closer to herd immunity, to the worst forms of cognitive contagion. And I think if we can do that, it's high time humanity set that as a goal for ourselves and worked to achieve it. And we can do it with the help of the science. So I just founded a nonprofit called the Cognitive Immunology Research Collaborative. That's CIRCE, CIRCE is the acronym. And if your listeners want to learn more, they can learn about the science of cognitive immunology at cognitivimmunology.net is the nonprofit's website. It explains the science. But the goal of the collaborative is to bring together leading researchers in this fledgling field of cognitive immunology and see if we can chart a path from where we are now, where humanity is hugely susceptible to morally disorienting ideas, to a future where we have a high degree of herd immunity to morally disorienting ideologies and ideas. So I think if we can do that over the next decade or so, we can hand our children and our grandchildren a far brighter future.
Mm-hmm. So since we talked at the beginning that people reason better in groups or collectives than individually, should we change certain social norms, or should we bring about new social norms to aid our cognition and perhaps to achieve, in this case, herd immunity?
Yes. So I think that good thinking adheres to norms that are learned first and foremost in dialogue. So Plato said, again, did I say this before? I forget. Plato said that thinking is the mind's dialogue with itself. And part of what he meant by that is that if you engage in good conversation, and the kind of conversation where you test ideas and you learn the ropes, you learn the norms that govern that practice, and that practice, you could describe that practice as philosophy or conversational idea testing or value inquiry. There are many different ways to describe it. But if you practice that art and learn and internalize those norms, then when you go off and think by yourself, your thinking is constrained in the right way. So yes, we need to, I would say, enculturate, first and foremost, young people in school environments to the art of conversational idea testing. And if they begin to internalize those norms and are able to have difficult conversations about right and wrong and the best way to organize our culture, our political systems, if you get kids involved in those conversations early, then when the time comes to actually debate politics, they do so in a much more civil, rational, and constructive way. So yes, it's a very social process, and the norms that govern really good dialogue are fundamental to good thinking.
Mm-hmm. So one last question. Do you think we should get rid of ideas like people are entitled to their own opinions?
Yes. So the idea that everyone is entitled to their opinion has been affirmed by people on the political left and people on the political right, in America at least, for centuries now. It's something of a unquestioned orthodoxy, and to even deny it, it sounds like you're advocating for a thought police. And I'm not advocating for a thought police. And I acknowledge that it's a bad idea to criminalize wrong thinking. I'm not claiming that we need political regulation of belief, but we do need to socially regulate belief, and ideally we do that through a collaborative process where people are brought to see for themselves why their beliefs aren't functioning well and freely relinquishing them. So I'm advocating for a non-coercive approach to belief regulation. And philosophers and scientists have advocated for that as well for a very long time. Let's see, I lost my train of thought. Bring me back to the question, Ricardo.
It was about if we should get rid of ideas like the one that people should be entitled to their own opinion.
Yes, thank you. So this idea has gained a great deal of currency. And the problem is that we interpret it not just as a political principle, but we unthinkingly accept it as a moral principle as well. So we think we're all entitled to any damn thing that happens to pop into our minds. I think it creates a culture where we feel cognitively entitled. And there's something like a decadence that sets in when we do that, where we insist so much on our rights, our entitlement to believe things, that we forget about our responsibilities. And I mean, rights and responsibilities have to be kept in balance, right? Free speech is a terribly important right, but you're not allowed to yell fire in a crowded theater because it can harm people. And in just the same way, yes, for the most part, we should be free to hatch ideas and entertain them. And it's not okay for me to simply indulge in white supremacist fantasies and spread hate online, right? And we need to be able to say that. So I think it's time we gave up the idea that we're all entitled to our opinions. To the extent that that idea tends to get us to ignore our cognitive responsibilities, it's not serving us well.
Okay, great. So the book is again Mental Immunity, Infectious Ideas, Mind-Parasites, and the Search for a Better Way of Thinking. There it is again. And Dr. Norman, just before we go, where can people find your work on the internet?
Thank you for asking. So the book is available wherever books are sold now. I think you'll be able to order it. It's just become just went on sale a couple of days ago. You can learn more about my work at my website, andynorman.org. And I'd love it if you wanted to follow my author page on Facebook at Andy Norman Author. You can learn a great deal about my attempts to promote cognitive immunology there, and maybe even become part of the cognitive immunology revolution. So I hope.
Okay, great. So I will be leaving links to all of that in the description box of the interview. And Dr. Norman, it's been a pleasure to talk to you.
And you, Ricardo. Thanks for the wonderful questions.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've been doing the channel for more than 3 years now, and it is thanks to people like you that it's been running for so long. And so if you like what I'm doing, please pay a visit to my Patreon page or to PayPal. All of the links are in the description box of the interview, and to consider making a pledge there, support the show. And otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share the interview, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and supporters, Karen Litska, Anne Blanchett, Pererga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollesy, Enric Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingart, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetriou, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Spinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Mikkel Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Yevon Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librand, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Miran B., Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Max Bailby, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Horowitz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Elman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal. My producers is Arwebi, Jim Frank, Lucas Tafinia, Kian Gilligan, Sergio Adriano, Luís Caetano, Tom Venegdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus France, and Niruban Balachandran, and my executive producers, Michelle Rugieski, Rosie James Pratt, and Matthew Lavender. Thank you for all.